Hello friends, welcome in today's lecture. In the last lecture, we saw the TCP/IP client sockets. In that, we saw the constructors of the client socket, methods of the client socket, and also the steps that are applied for the communication with the server. So, we total saw the 4 steps for client communicate with the server. First step is the client initiate connection to the server by using the specified host name or the IP address and the port number. Second, send the data to the server using the output stream. Third, read the data from the server using the input stream. And fourth step is close the connection. These 4 steps are used to connection with the server. Now in this lecture we saw how to connect server to the client. So TCP/IP server socket. In last lecture we already saw there are 2 sockets. First is server socket and second is client socket. For the client communication, the client uses the socket and the server socket uses the server socket class. So total 2 classes is used in the TCP/IP. For the client communication, the socket class is used, and for the server communication, the server socket class is used. The server socket class is used to create a servers that listen to its client. So main use of the server socket is to as a listener, and all time the server is waiting for the client request. When the server socket is created, it will be a register itself with the system so that client can connect to the particular application. And this class throws the exception, input output exception, that is IO exception. So server socket throws the IO exception and socket class throws the 2 exception, that is IO exception and unknown host exception. If an input output error occur when creating a socket, that time the client socket class throws the IO exception. And if the IP address of the host could not be determined or found, that time the client socket throws the unknown host exception. And TCP/IP server socket throws only one exception, that is the IO exception. So if an input output error occur when creating a server socket, that time the IO exception is thrown. So in the TCP/IP client socket, 2 exception is thrown. First is IO exception and second is unknown host exception. And in the TCP/IP server socket, this class throws the 1 exception, that is the IO exception. To create a server application, we need to create an instance of a server socket class. So at a time we create a server application, that time first we need to create an instance of a server socket class or an object of the server socket class. See one example, here we are using a 6666 port number for a communication between the client and server. See here syntax is server socket SS. SS is an object or instance of a server socket class is equal to new server socket and port number is 6666. Then next, socket S is equal to ss.accept method. You may also choose any other port number. And the accept method waits for the client. If the client connect with a given port number, it returns an instance of a socket. So the accept method is used in the server socket, and this method waits for a client. So these 2 statements used to establish a connection and waits for the client. Next, see the constructors in the server socket class. There are 4 constructors of the server socket class. First constructor is public server socket having one parameter int port, and it throws the IO exception. So this constructor creates a socket and bound to the specified port. Means to create a server socket bound to the specified port number. An exception occur if the port is already bound by the another application. That time the IO exception is occur. Second constructor is public server socket having two parameters int port and int backlog, throws IO exception. Similar to the previous constructor, the backlog parameter specifies how many incoming clients to store in the wait queue. Means this constructor creates a server socket and bind it to the specified local port number with the specified backlog. Third constructor is public server socket having three parameters int port, int backlog and inet address throws IO exception. This constructor also similar to the previous constructor. The inet address parameter specifies the local IP address to bind to the particular port, and the inet address is used for the server that may have multiple IP addresses, allowing a server to specify which of its IP address to accept the client request on. Means this constructor creates a server socket with the specified port, then listen the backlog and local IP address to bind particular application. Fourth constructor is public server socket throws IO exception. This constructor creates a unbound server socket. When using this constructor, use the bind method when you are ready to bind the server socket. So these are the four constructors of the server socket. The server socket class. The server socket class can be used to create a server socket, and this object is used to establish a communication with the client. Means server socket class object is used to establish a communication with the client. The server socket class having two methods. First is accept method and second is close method. Public socket accept method. This method returns the socket and establish a connection between the server and client. Second method is public synchronizer void close. The close method is used to close the server socket. So these two are the methods of the server socket class. Next, see the steps that invoke the developing the server program. So server socket follows these 5 steps to create a connection with the client. First step is create a server socket and bind it to the specific port number. Second step is listen for connection from the client and accept it. This results in the client socket is created for a connection. Third step is read the data from the client via the input stream obtained from the client socket. Fourth step, send the data to the client via the client sockets using the output stream. And fifth is close the connection with the client. And the last is close the connection of the server, that is terminate the server. See all these steps one by one in detail. First step, create a server socket and bind it to the specific port number. Create a new object of the server socket class by using the one of the following constructor. So in the first step, first create a server socket class object using the any constructor. In the last slide we saw 4 constructors of the server socket. Public server socket int port, Second constructor is public server socket int port and int backlog. Third constructor is server socket int port int backlog init address, and fourth constructor is public server socket. So using any one of the following constructor, these four constructor, the server socket create a object of the server socket. Then first constructor is mainly preferred for a communication with the client and server. See one example to declare or create a server socket object. The following line of code creates a server socket and bind it to the port number 6868. Server socket object is server socket is equal to new server socket and having port number is 6868. This statement create a server socket object and bind to the port number 6868. Next step is listen for the connection from the client and accept it. This result in a client socket is created for a connection. Means once the server socket instance is created, server socket call the accept method to start the listening for incoming client request. And the syntax is socket is equal to server socket dot accept. So accept method is used to start the listening for the incoming clients. And here note that the accept method block the current thread until a connection is represented by the returner socket object. So the server socket uses the accept method to start the listening of the incoming client request. And this result in a client socket is created by the connection. Third step is read the data from the client via input stream obtained from the client socket. Means once the socket object is returned, you can use the input stream to read the data sent from the client. Means all the time server is waiting for the client request, and when the client is send some data to the server, then server using the input stream, it reads the data, and the syntax of that is input stream input is equal to socket dot get input stream. The input stream allows you to read the data at the low level, that is read to byte of an array. So if we want to read the data in a higher level, that time we use the input stream reader. See here, if you want to read the data in a higher level, that time we use the input stream reader to read the data as a character, and the syntax is input stream reader is equal to new input stream reader input, and the character is in a reader dot read method. You can also wrap the input stream in the buffer reader to read the data as a string for more convenient, and the syntax is buffer reader is equal to new buffer reader new input stream reader input, and string is in a line is equal to reader dot read line. Means the input stream reader and buffer reader are used to read the data as a character or as a string respectively. See, the next step is step number 4. Send the data to the client via the client socket output stream. Output stream associated with the socket to send the data to the client. For example, output stream output is equal to socket dot get output stream. Also, we can wrap it in a print writer method to send the data in a text format. We already seen the syntax of the print writer in a previous lecture. Printer print writer is equal to printer writer, write is equal to new printer writer, output true. Means the argument true indicate that the writer flushes the data after each method call. Means print writer method is used to send the data in a text format. And when you use the byte of an array, that time we use the write method. Fifth step is close the connection with the client. A server should always running or waiting for incoming request from the client. Means server is always in a running or waiting for the incoming request from the client. In case suppose server must be stopped for some reason, that time call the invoke close method on the client socket to terminate the connection with the client. Means in the some cases server must stop for some any other reason, that time the close method on the client socket used to terminate the connection with the client, and the syntax is socket.close. This close method close the connection with the client. And last step is terminate the server. A server should be always running waiting for incoming request from the client, and in case the server must be stopped for some reason, then call the close method on the server socket instance. Means using the server socket object, server socket.close. So total 6 steps of the steps that are used to create a connection between the server to client. First, initiate the or create an object of the server socket class and bind to the specific port number. Second step is listen for the connection using the accept method. Third is read the data from the client via the input stream. Fourth is send the data to the client via the output stream. Fifth step is close the connection with the client, and sixth step is terminate the server. So here we complete the TCP/IP server socket. In last lecture we saw the TCP/IP client socket, and in this lecture we see what is the TCP/IP server socket. Now in the next lecture we study one example or program of the TCP/IP client server application.